What is IoT, or the Internet of Things? Well, it's a phrase to describe an ever-growing network of real-world objects that are connected to the internet. Examples include your smartphone, your smart lights, fitness trackers, and more. In other words, IoT blurs the line between the real world and the digital world. An interesting use case for IoT is machine-to-machine payments. Imagine there existed a network of sensors that collected weather-related data. You have a phone app that purchases this data in real time in order to craft a reliable forecast of the day's weather. What sort of payment system will we need to support such a use case? Well, we would need something that's scalable. There's over 26 billion, and yes, that's billion, IoT devices out there as of 2019. That's a lot of potential transactions. Furthermore, we need a system that's lightweight. IoT devices can be small sensors with very limited computational resources. Will they be able to participate? Finally, and most importantly, we need a system that allows for feeless transactions. A class of transactions, microtransactions, can take place between machines. Does it make sense to pay dollars in fees for a transaction that's worth less than a cent? Today, we talk about IOTA, a project that provides groundbreaking insight into a scalable, lightweight, and feeless ledger that can power payments for IoT. Furthermore, we have the distinct privilege of talking with Sergey Popov, one of the original co-founders of IOTA. Through him, we'll gain even deeper insight into what IOTA is all about. This is the White Paper Center, brought to you by Randall Richard Raymond.
Hey.
Hello?
Hello?
Hey, Sergey, how's it going? I had called Sergey, co-founder of IOTA, and we quickly got acquainted. The plan was to interlace the reading of the white paper with a conversation with Sergey himself.
Great. So, first thing to start off with, just for those who may not know too much about you, do you mind introducing yourself and, what you've done in the space and, a little bit more about who you are?
Yeah, sure. By the way, thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Yep.
I'm originally from Moscow. I graduated from the Moscow State University as the mathematician. Then, more than 20 years ago, went to Brazil. And, I just constructed all my academic career here in Brazil. So right now I'm a professor in the University of Campinas, also known as Unicamp.
Mm.
And, I'm just a hardcore mathematician. I prove theorems. That's my kind of main work. My area is stochastic processes, Markov chains, probability theory in general, this sort of stuff. But some almost 6 years ago, I came across an article about Bitcoin. Read it, liked the idea very much. Thought, okay, I will mine Bitcoin now and become rich. But okay, then unfortunately discovered that it's not so easy to become rich in this world for some reason. And but anyway, I found the idea behind Bitcoin really, really great, just genius thing. So I started to read more about Bitcoin, started to read about alternative cryptocurrencies. So I registered on this famous, maybe infamous forum, bitcointalk.org,
Yep.
Started reading it. At some moment, I came across a very interesting and novel concept of cryptocurrency called NXT.
Mm.
It was the kind of first pure proof of stake cryptocurrency. And yeah, I liked the idea very much. I liked in particular that you don't need to really mine it by wasting so much energy. And yeah, so then I kind of started to read their forums, started to talk with people, started to talk with the founder of NXT, who is by chance also called Sergey, is from Belarus. So, and yeah, at some point, I just made some calculations about the blockchain of NXT. I have to explain, by the way, that all blockchains generally have a lot to do with something called Poisson process. Well, it's a mathematical model, very well known, and it happens that I kind of know a lot about it because well, that's my specialty. So yeah, if you want to really understand blockchain, you need to understand this Poisson process somehow. And well, I did some back of envelope calculations about the blockchain of NXT, like what's the probability that you generate a block, probability of forking, many sort of stuff. And then posted these calculations on this NXT forum. Well, people saw it. Then people said, "Oh, that's great. I mean, looks great. It's not possible to understand anything, but it looks great, you know." And then I kind of became the mathematician of the community of NXT. I mean, it was not quite so much an achievement because the mathematics there is not very profound, but well, still it's a decent mathematics. I even published these notes later in this Ledger journal. I think a couple of years ago or so. But anyway, then the story was that after a couple of years, in the beginning of 2015, the founder of NXT, Sergey Ivancheglo, together with another guy from NXT community called David Zonsteberg, they invited me to their new project, which is now known as IOTA.
Right.
The name was not there from the beginning, but well, they invited me kind of to be the mathematician of the project, to write a white paper, to lay the theoretical ground of it, and so on.
Right.
So then the whole first half of 2015, we were kind of sitting and trying to figure out how to do it, because there are many challenges in the IOTA design that I maybe will talk about later. But well, in October, more or less, it was ready, and then I think you know more or less what happened after. There was a token sale, and then in 2016 there was a first version of the network, and then the community grew, and well, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I'm still doing research about IOTAs. It's very interesting.
That's fantastic. So it's really been a pretty long and rich history you've had both in the space and also specifically within IOTA. That's fantastic. And
Thanks.
kind of what I see from a top level is both your role almost as kind of the mathematician of the community and also IOTA and that kind of motivation to get into the project when the other Sergey originally invited you on board. But there seems to be another pretty big component of IOTA itself, which is the idea of empowering kind of this ecosystem for machines to send transactions to one another, right? And IOTA promises to be sort of the payment system to help fuel payments between IoT devices, right? But one thing that I think a lot of people will love to know is, right, what are some of the use cases that you guys are most excited about for machine-to-machine payments?
Well, I may be not the best person to speak about this because I'm a mathematician and mathematicians live in imaginary worlds. They kind of don't care too much about the real world. But well, if you think about what IoT is supposed to be, well, there will be a lot of small chips, sensors, whatever, around the world, and they will send a lot of transactions here and there, and these transactions may be of really small value, or even of zero value. You can send just data. For instance, you're driving on the highway and someone is interested in the statistics related to this, like how you accelerate, what is the gas consumption, I don't know, anything related to such stuff. And then your car may have a node which would send small pieces of this information more or less continuously and receive very small payments for this information. I imagine this will not cost a lot, but well, it's still nice to be able to receive for this kind of data stuff. By the way, there is a project called Data Marketplace in the IOTA ecosystem, which is more or less about this. Sell data for some small amount of money. But again, I'm not the best person to speak about this. I'm more a theory guy.
And either way, I thought that was a fantastic use case, right? Because for those who are listening who might be car enthusiasts or people who repair cars, one thing I know a little bit about is sort of the onboard diagnostics available in a car. And I think it'd be a great use case, kind of what you're saying, to be able to almost relay that data that you normally get through Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to some node and have that node stream that data, receiving some payments to either the cloud or some other third-party provider who can, process that data and give that information another way. So I think that's actually a fantastic use case.
So there are many possible use cases, but
right.
You are invited to join our community on Discord and talk to them.
Oh yeah. And in fact, we can at the end of the talk we can provide some of those details, such as the Reddit, the Discord, any Telegram chats, so people who are listening can also get into the know about where those channels are. But great. So
but you have to be careful and not to choose a chat of speculators, because these guys only talk about money.
Right.
on the main Discord, for instance, it's forbidden to speculate because, well, if you permit it, then it will become difficult.
Yeah, ideally we want people that actually want to talk about the technology.
IOTA is both scalable and feeless. That sounds too good to be true, right? Well, how does it do it? Well, first, it completely does away with the blockchain structure, replacing it with something called a DAG, or directed acyclic graph. A DAG is a graph where one node on the DAG can point to any other node on the graph as long as it doesn't create a cycle. The crux of this DAG structure is that there is no longer only one place for new transactions to be added to, as is the case with blockchains. Transactions can connect to any opening on the graph. To solve for fees, IOTA completely does away with the idea that there needs to be separate classes of validators and transaction issuers. Instead, every participant in the network is both a validator and an issuer. More specifically, in order to issue a transaction, you must also validate other transactions. Issuing transaction is relatively simple in IOTA. A network participant will select two other transactions. Then they'll make sure the transactions are valid. After that, they'll solve a small cryptographic puzzle to prevent spam, and finally, they'll add their own transaction to the DAG. There is a property of distributed ledger technology known as finality, which is a point in which a transaction can no longer be reversed. Finality is critical to the security of a network. Bitcoin has probabilistic finality. Typically, after a transaction has been buried under 6 blocks, it is nearly impossible for an attacker to reverse the transaction. When IOTA was first created, finality was possible thanks to a special agent known as the coordinator. The coordinator periodically issues transactions called milestones, which effectively say that all transactions that come before the milestone transaction are valid. Nonetheless, this coordinator makes IOTA centralized. Recently, the IOTA team has released an extension to IOTA called Coordicide, which removes the coordinator. Thanks to Coordicide, IOTA can be scalable, decentralized, secure, and feeless.
Another big thing that's going on in IOTA is definitely the recent news. By recent, I say earlier this year, but the big news about the Coordicide and the
Coordicide, yeah.
Right. And so before we even get into the Coordicide, I think I'd love to know your take and understanding on the original motivation for even having a coordinate in the first place.
Well, so the original white paper of IOTA, it was not really about IOTA. It was about the mathematical model of IOTA. And it was kind of shown in a more or less mathematical way that if in such a system the amount of honest transactions is much bigger than the amount of dishonest transactions issued by attackers or someone, then it will work fine. There will be no double spends and nothing of the sort. So, well, then what we basically did was we added some basic proof of work. In order to issue a transaction, you have to do some proof of work. It's not comparable to proof of work needed to mine a block on Bitcoin. So in IOTA, as you know, it's the users that insert transactions into the ledger, not the miners. Mm-hmm. We did this precisely in order to eliminate fees because, well, if you have miners, they will charge fees one way or another. So we had to kind of build a collaborative system out of principle. You help me and I help you, right?
Exactly.
So there would be only users who collaborate between each other. Like I vouch for your transactions, you vouch for my transactions, and it goes like this. And but then the problem was that there were kind of two paths. Either you raise difficulty so much that you would start needing some, I don't know, ASICs or FPGAs or whatever in order to issue transactions. And then it would be kind of problematic for Internet of Things, right?
Exactly. Yeah. We don't want fees for thing.
Yeah, and then they will be mining center for mining these transactions, and they would charge the fees. And what the hell? Why the hell would we design such a system to get into the same sort of shit? Sorry, again. So well, now, right now, you can issue a transaction on your cell phone with some, I don't remember, maybe 10 seconds of proof of work or something. So you see, it's not quite comparable to the amount of proof of work needed to mine a block in Bitcoin. But on the other hand, you would imagine that if you rely only on this, only on proof of work, then, well, at some moment, someone would maybe build an ASIC and issue a lot of transactions, maybe double spend and destroy the network. So we kind of sacrificed the decentralizedness, if you permit me to tell this word, of the system in the beginning to make it secure, to be able to test the engineering solutions, software solutions, to make the system that actually works in practice. Then the network would grow, the adoption would grow, and then we would remove the coordinator in due time. Well, it's more or less now this time we published our solution for Coordicide in May.
Right.
And since then we are working on it very actively. But what we published was a more theoretical one, and then since then our vision evolved a little bit. It continues more or less the same, but now we know about some better way to solve it. So I don't know if you want me to describe in more details how does it work, or
I think because some of the details and more fine-grained details of how it works, I'll mention that in other parts of the podcast. So that part's fine. But I think what you provided was also great in its own way, right? Because I think that also gives more motivation for why a lot of the things are the way they are on IOTA, especially the parts with, not having any fees, right? Having miners would have created a system where we needed fees. And also, one thing I want to kind of come back to is the whole point of the coordinator, right? Because my understanding, at least, was that the coordinator was a device used to ensure finality in
Yes,
IOTA.
exactly.
Right.
It's a finality device.
Right.
Exactly this.
Do you mind explaining to those listening why finality is important, especially within the context of distributed ledger technology?
So in general, the main problem of distributed ledgers is that there is no physical object that represents your money. If you have a banknote, then you can pay it to me, but after you paid it to me, you cannot pay to another guy by the same banknote. Okay. Or if you have a gold coin, then it's again the same. Now, in distributed ledgers, in digital distributed ledgers, well, the basic problem which needs to be solved is the problem of double spending. Because it's a problem in every distributed ledger that exists in this world. So basically, I can sign a transaction paying 1 Bitcoin or 1 IOTA to you, and I can also sign a transaction which pays the same Bitcoin or the same IOTA to someone else. Then it would be a problem if both these transactions were considered valid, because in this case, instead of spending one Bitcoin which belongs to me, I would spend kind of something that does not belong to me, and it's obviously kind of against the very idea of money.
Right.
So this problem needs to be addressed in one way or another. And the really great discovery of Satoshi Nakamoto was this proof of work blockchain idea, where basically what is included in the blockchain is valid. And the rules are that you cannot include two contradicting transactions there. So if I can still issue two contradicting transactions, but only one of them would be included in the blockchain and the other would just die out.
Exactly.
So this is then really, really great idea of Satoshi Nakamoto. I mean, the exact way about how to do it.
Right. That's a great way of putting it, right? Because at the end of the day, the biggest issue is that double spend issue, right? And Satoshi Nakamoto was that guy who really started who really solved that issue of the double spend, right? But that also explored that idea of finality, which you guys integrate into your piece with the coordinator. But now we see a world without the coordinator, which brings us to Coordicide, which is a very great, innovation for the whole community.
So putting aside feelessness for a second, there are 3 properties of distributed ledger technology that everyone talks about. All right, this is almost like the holy grail of distributed ledger technology. It's scalability, decentralization, and security. Historically, it was considered very difficult to design a system that has all 3 properties. We already understand what scalability is. It's the system doesn't impose limits on the transaction rate. Decentralization is the idea that any network participants can fully participate in consensus. Security means that an attacker can't influence consensus and overthrow the network. We can already see how Bitcoin struggles with satisfying all 3 constraints thanks to scalability. IOTA with the coordinator also doesn't satisfy the 3 properties. The coordinator is the only entity that can make transactions final. As a result, the coordinator is a centralized point of failure. However, taking out the coordinator is not an easy process. Removing the coordinator introduces a number of challenges for consensus and security. The IOTA team introduces several modules that work to solve the Coordicide problem, such that the network can reach consensus in a decentralized and secure manner.
One of the first things that stuck out to me when I was looking more into Coordicide was this idea that you wanted to put things into different modules, right? So you have your auto peering system, you have your spam protection systems, spam detection system, your tip selection algorithm, all these different things that you consider modules. Why was it important for you guys to separate Coordicide into different modules, and what does this mean for the further development of IOTA?
Well, I would say that it's always good to separate a complex system into different modules, because this way you understand it better. Of course, you should understand it holistically, how these models interact between each other. But it's when you build a car, you would make, okay, here are the wheels, here is the engine, and so on and so forth. They do different things, but together they make you drive. Yeah.
Right.
So we just thought about what do we need for the network to work well. So for this, we need that the nodes of the network would interact between each other, and there must be some sort of Sybil protection in the sense that it should not be possible for many fake identities to enter the network and to mess with the consensus. And so for this, auto-peering is an important ingredient, well, because you need to propagate transactions in the network. You kind of talk to your neighbors and you send them new transactions. They send you new transactions. You also ask them, okay, what do you think about these transactions? Are they good? They say, well, I like them. And you say, okay, maybe I like them too. And so on and so forth. So it's a complex system, and to understand it well, you need to break it into the components.
That's a great way of putting it, right? Modularity allows you to make a bigger system just the sum of its parts in many ways.
A world without a coordinator needs identities for nodes. This will become important for later aspects of the consensus where nodes cast votes. However, identities come with their fair share of challenges, most notably Sybil attacks. A Sybil attack is an attack where nodes forge multiple fake identities. As we discussed in previous episodes, proof of work is a Sybil-resistant scheme that prevents nodes from assuming multiple identities. However, proof of work is too costly and slow for the purposes of IOTA. Proof of stake is another Sybil-resistant scheme, but it's much more desirable since it's generally more scalable. In proof of stake, by proving ownership of the network's base currency, network participants can become more privileged members of consensus. Proof of stake has a couple of security vulnerabilities, however. Thankfully, these vulnerabilities only arise in longest chain wins consensus protocols, which isn't the case with IOTA. IOTA combines proof of stake with a reputation system to create something called mana. Mana is both a Sybil-resistant scheme and a system that incentivizes desirable behavior within consensus. Transactions emit mana that can be sent to a specified node. For example, if Bob issues a transaction to Alice, a certain amount of mana relative to the value of the transaction is also transferred. Bob could then send this mana to himself. Mana is therefore a signal for how trustworthy a node is. Issuing transactions or providing other good services to the network can increase one's mana and thus trustworthiness.
To get a little bit more into some of these subsystems, one that I found probably the most interesting, and it's very novel in the space, is this idea of mana, right? And so what I understand with mana is it's almost like this way of rewarding good behavior, where one of these desirable behaviors is issuing transactions, right? So one thing I really want to talk about, and for all the listeners also, tuning in, can you explain exactly why it's important for, a node to issue a lot of transactions or a healthy flow of transactions?
Well, it was important in the original white paper version, because they kind of considered transactions as votes. In the Coordicide, it's even not so much important to issue a lot of transactions. I mean, it will happen anyway because, well, Internet of Things is there for work. It will work and produce a lot of stuff, I guess. But what money is important about is, for example, it permits you to distinguish between important nodes and not so important ones. You need to own some tokens. You need to issue transactions, or maybe you need to do some service for the community so that others would give this money for you. By the way, the idea is that Money is kind of similar to proof of stake, but I wouldn't call it proof of stake because, first of all, it's not a leader election protocol to begin with, and also you can give mana to another node. For instance, if you have some, I don't know, IoT devices, you don't need to physically send them, physically, no, virtually send. You don't need to send tokens to those small devices because, well, they may be hacked or something. But you can only send mana. You kind of send tokens to yourself, but in the transaction you say, give mana to those small nodes so that they gain some weight in the network.
Another important component of the consensus process is spam protection. Imagine you had a node that flooded the network with millions of useless transactions, right? So to prevent situations like this, IOTA implements a couple of spam protection features. First, nodes must solve a cryptographic puzzle before issuing a transaction. The difficulty of this puzzle is based on how many transactions a node sends within the time interval. The maximum number of transactions a node can send over a time interval is capped by the node's mana and a predetermined max transaction rate. In other words, a more trustworthy node can issue more transactions per second up to some limit.
But, another important module besides, mana, reputation, and auto peering is also spam protection, right? And so can you explain a little bit why spam protection is so important, especially within the context of IOTA?
Well, it's actually a very natural thing that the bandwidth is not infinite. You cannot download stuff. You cannot download a lot of stuff instantaneously. You cannot process arbitrary amount of transactions. So, of course, at this initial stage, when we didn't speak about sharding so far, or as we call it, slicing.
Yep.
It is something that planned. It is a way to really scale the system, right?
Right.
But so far, at the current stage, in every cryptocurrency in this world, basically, every node have to process every transaction. So you have to basically download you have to know the whole blockchain,
right,
in the blockchain-based systems. So and of course it's not really scalable because it's fine to process like 7 transactions per second, like Bitcoin. Then you can store all this stuff, hopefully for a lot of time. But if you think about 10,000 or 100,000 transactions per second, it just there is no way for you to download them all, to process them all. So you need somehow to distribute this job between different nodes in some secure way, and it's a very active research area in more or less all distributed all cryptocurrency systems which are there. But yeah, coming back to the spam protection issue, right now when there is kind of a limit for throughput caused by physical limitations of the hardware, you somehow need to limit the ability of actors to issue transactions, because if they issue too many transactions, then maybe the nodes would not be able to cope with all these transactions. And we do not want to really to rely on proof of work for this, because, well, you know very well that proof of work is really, really disproportional. I mean, you can make a hardware, you can make an ASIC which would outpace conventional computer by literally millions.
Yep.
Yeah. So we don't want to take this route, and so there will be a kind of spam protection based on a variant of mana. It doesn't have to be necessarily the same mana as the one used for baiting the boats, but it can be something similar. And the idea is that, okay, if you are more important, then in the regime when the network is kind of overloaded, in this high load regime, the nodes would kind of observe your quotas. So if you have more mana, you have more quota for issuing transactions.
Right. And I think that's great because you're using that system of reputation to kind of set a max on how much someone can almost flood the network, right? And you'd expect that someone more trustworthy would use that power in the right way. And I say power very loosely, but you kind of get what I mean. That's awesome.
As discussed earlier, in order for a node to issue a transaction, it needs to approve of two other transactions. How does it decide what two transactions to approve of? This is where the tip selection algorithm comes into play. The output of the algorithm is two transactions that the node should approve of. Both transactions are biased towards a transaction that hasn't been approved of yet. These types of transactions are called tips. The first transaction, outputted by the algorithm, favors very recently added tips. The second transaction is generally a random selection that's meant to find the honest tips that were issued a long time ago but were left behind.
And I think besides spam protection, another great thing to talk about is the tip selection algorithm, or TSA, as we talk about in the white paper. And what I find most fascinating here is it seems like originally in the first white paper that you authored, there was one version of this tip selection algorithm, but now there was, some conversation on that, and it's been changing, right? And now we have a new tip selection algorithm. Can you talk about the difference between the two, and what motivated this difference?
Yeah, the thing here is that actually it is not possible to enforce any particular tip selection algorithm, because, well, they are random. You randomly choose two tips, but this randomly choose can mean different things depending on how you do it exactly. Mm-hmm. Right? But, well, it's really not possible to verify from outside how did you choose those two tips. Just since you do it randomly, it's not possible to figure out which exact tip selection algorithm did you use. And so it's a fundamental, it's a really fundamental feature of IOTA, of the Tangle, that the nodes are in principle free to use a tip selection algorithm which they choose. Yeah. I mean, we know that, okay, mostly people will download the software and will just run it, and the software will work as it was designed, but nothing prevents you from hacking the software and changing the tip selection algorithm.
Right.
And then a very interesting question is that, you have to propose a good tip selection algorithm so that there would be no incentive for other people to hack it.
Mm-hmm.
If something is already good, why would you bother changing it?
Yep.
So yeah, it's something called Nash equilibrium in game theory.
Gotcha.
I even have a paper I think called Equilibria in the Tangle, which studies the question of Nash equilibriums for that original white paper tip selection algorithm, and concludes that it's more or less close to Nash equilibrium, to a good Nash equilibrium. And so there would be little incentive for anybody to hack it. But anyways, the problem.
I should honestly do a white paper reading on that as well. But could you, just as a little aside, can you explain for the viewers who might not know what Nash equilibrium is in game theory?
Okay, so the Nash equilibrium in game theory is basically the following. So suppose that we are two people or a group of people are playing some games, and they can earn money and lose money depending on the outcome. And each one of them has a strategy, which is maybe deterministic, maybe probabilistic. You kind of probabilistic means you, with some probability, you do one thing, with another probability, you do a different thing, and so on. Well, everybody who played poker or something similar knows more or less what is this. So you receive your cards and you think what to do with them. So maybe with this kind of cards, I will just quit the game, and with that kind of cards, I will stay in the game. And well, anyway. Now, Nash equilibrium means that suppose. Well, it's actually easy to explain what is absence of Nash equilibrium. My strategy. So the set of strategies of all players is not Nash equilibrium. If I, as a player, can modify my strategy in such a way that my expected reward, expected gain, becomes larger. You see?
Mm-hmm.
And the situation when it's not possible is called Nash equilibrium. So in the Nash equilibrium, everybody would just use their strategies, and they have no incentive to deviate from them.
Yeah. So it's almost an equilibrium in motivation or incentive, but it's almost like an equilibrium, and there's nothing better for me to do in this situation.
Yes, that's the idea.
All right, and that's great, and that's great news for IOTA, right? Because that's what we want in this situation, because we don't want to give attackers any incentives to spread out into a parasitic chain or anything like that. We want everyone's kind of incentives to be in equilibrium.
Yeah. That's great. But, well, we were talking about tip selection.
Right. Yes.
Actually, the problem with the white paper, the original white paper tip selection algorithm, is not so much theoretical, it's more practical.
Mm-hmm.
There is something called cumulative weight.
Right.
In that original white paper, it's cumulative weight of a transaction is the number of other transactions which reference this transaction directly or indirectly. And it turned out that when the flow of transactions is really large, is really high, it takes a lot of time to calculate all these cumulative weights. It's just computationally heavy.
I see.
So it has the white paper tip selection algorithm is very interesting object from purely mathematical point of view.
Mm-hmm.
One of my former students, for example, have almost finished a complicated mathematical paper about this model, and it's really beautiful from mathematical point of view. But not all things which are mathematically interesting are physically useful, you know.
Mm.
And the problem with the original white paper was that we wanted to kind of embed everything into tip selection. So we wanted the tip selection algorithm to take care of the security. We wanted the tip selection algorithm to be kind of at least close to mesh equilibrium, so that others would not start to modify it. We wanted to maintain kind of healthy tangle, like everything good gets included in the end, you know. We wanted this tip selection algorithm to do everything for us.
Right.
And you know, when you want to do everything, it may be not so easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you want to do everything at the same time, maybe not a good idea. At least not always. So
exactly.
And at some moment, we actually had an idea that it's possible to decouple the security from tip selection.
Mm.
So instead of letting tip selection algorithm to care about the security or absence of double spans, we can have the nodes talk to each other,
mm-hmm.
and just decide based on this conversation, decide which transactions should be valid and which should not be valid, and then the tip selection can be much easier. You don't need to calculate cumulative weights anymore. You don't need to do this random walk on the graph, which also was computationally a bit too heavy. You can just more or less select two tips at random. And this is much cheaper,
right,
from the computational point of view. Well, it's not exactly just select two tips at random. You still need to distinguish between kind of good tips and bad tips, but it's much easier when you don't need to ensure safety anymore in tip selection.
Perhaps the most important part of consensus is conflict resolution. What happens if two transaction tips exist in the IOTA DAG and they conflict? One transaction has Bob spending his 5 IOTA to Alice, while the other transaction has Bob spending that same 5 IOTA to Joe. Which one is correct? This is where voting comes into play. The general process is known as the shimmer. With shimmer, nodes form their opinion on a conflict by talking to a small subset of other nodes. In one implementation of the shimmer, cellular consensus, if the majority of a node's neighbors think transaction B is correct and transaction A is false, then the node will similarly change their opinion to think transaction B is correct. This creates a sort of ripple effect where all nodes eventually reach consensus on which transaction was valid. Mana also plays a role in weighing the opinion of neighbors. Another implementation is fast probabilistic consensus. Fast probabilistic consensus splits consensus into multiple rounds. In each round, a node queries the opinion of a different random subset of nodes. The node then derives its opinion from the majority opinion. However, this majority is not a simple 51% decision. The majority is defined by decentralized random number.
Going on into, one of the probably the most important part of the whole thing, and one of the last parts. We have something called the shimmer that's introduced near the end of the new white paper. And right
this
now,
Go Shimmer is what is kind of AlphaNet.
Right.
It's experimental network written by the researchers in order to test and validate the Coordicide, the Coordicide ideas. So it's kind of experimental test bed. It will not be the basis of the mainnet. The mainnet will there will be another route to mainnet, which I also don't understand very well because I'm a theory guy.
Yep.
But I have to confess that I wrote my last piece of code maybe 20 years ago. So really theoretical. But Go Shimmer is open source. It's not yet 100% ready, but it's close to being ready. And there are some modules which more or less will work already. You can install and test, and we will be actually very, very glad if you play with it, because we really need community feedback.
Yeah, I would personally love to, and I'm sure there's a bunch of people tuning in for this episode that would also be very interested in that. So I think that's great that you guys have made that open source, and talking a little bit about how you're saying it will be ready soon. There's this talk of the future, and the future seems very exciting right now, especially for this project. And I guess to ask you one last question, what are you most excited about for the future of IOTA, and why? And it could be anything, right? It can be upcoming projects that you're working on within IOTA, or just anything that you really can think of.
Oh, I have to confess that I really did not think about it, because I kind of prefer solving problems as they come in the order of. So
and that's a good way to look at life.
Yeah. So the most exciting thing is what I'm doing now. Right now, it's we are kind of finishing the specifications, figuring out the details of how exactly tip selection should be, how exactly you should choose checkpoints. It's another story which is not in the Coordicide white paper, but it will be in the next version. It's kind of another auxiliary device that permits you to do some things. And there is also this sharding, or as we call it, slicing. It's very, very exciting story as well. Some people think that it's easier to shard blockchains, but I think it's exactly the opposite. Because the DAGs are kind of more continuous, more fluid. You can imagine kind of one DAG, one tango around the Earth, and each node only sees some small or not so small neighborhood around it, but still, by some magic, it's a secure system, although you don't even see the transactions from the other side of the globe. But on the other hand, you probably don't need to know them, like in practice, no? And that's all these are very exciting and interesting questions.
That's a great answer, and I really like that talk about sharding and scalability, because that will be that is a big question for a lot of these distributed ledger technology, and it seems like IOTA currently has a big advantage right now. So it's been very exciting to hear about this, and it's also been very exciting talking to you today. I mean, it's truly been an honor. I want to say that again, to be able to, have this conversation with you.
Equally, thank you very much. It was a great conversation. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. And like we said earlier in the talk, there are a few things, a few ways you can get involved in IOTA. And why don't you, Sergey, mention some of those? I know you mentioned the Discord earlier. Are there other ways that you would like to see the community get involved in IOTA?
Yeah, well, I think the main IOTA Discord is really the place. There is also Reddit. So to enter the Discord, you go to discord.iota.org, and then you will get an invite. Then you will have to kind of click and to accept terms and conditions, which include not talking about price. And then you're there in the community. It's really a great community. I think you can find me there as well. So yeah, I think that Discord is the main place, but there is also this IOTA subreddit. Yeah, there are some groups on Facebook and Telegram, and actually I'm on Facebook alone. I'm in 3 or 4 groups, but yeah.
Great.
I think the main place really is the Discord.
Got it. Okay, that sounds good. And so, like Sergey was saying, to all those tuning in, there's a lot of great technology out there, and there's a lot of ways we can, help out and contribute. Just make sure you don't talk about prices, but as long as we can, have these conversations, try to contribute. There's a lot of great things in the future or in store for us, both for crypto and in general for technology. So thank you again, Sergey, and good luck to you and the IOTA team.
Thank you.
And that's all we have for you today. In our next episode, we'll be doing a guided reading of Nicholas von Saberhagen's white paper on Monero titled Crypto Note version 2.